Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Maureen Dunne, author of the Neurodiversity Edge to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Maureen, welcome to the show. Before we start, please can you share a little bit about your background and purpose, as well as the journey that got you to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. My background, I've been working in the neurodiversity space for over 2 decades. I've had a lot of different roles. In terms of expertise, I studied at Oxford. I did my doctorate at the University of Oxford when I was on a Rhodes Scholarship. Also did a master's at LSE. But in addition to my research and organizational culture and business management experience, I also have lived experience. I have kids that are neurodivergent. So this is something that's been a huge passion of mine for many, many years.
No, that's really good. It's a work passion as well as an actual life passion as well.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned in the intro, you recently published a book called The Neurodiversity Edge, which has received a lot of plaudits. It's a practical guide really for all HR leaders looking to build a neurodiversity culture. So for the benefit of our listeners, could you provide your definition of neurodiversity?
Sure. Yeah. And just for the listeners, I guess it's important to know that it's an evolving concept. Like there's a history, of the neurodiversity movement and the concept. And, it started out in the mid 1990s where a lot of mostly autistic people were finding each other on the internet. And then a sociologist named Judy Singer had coined the term, but it's an evolving concept, and I think most people would agree that it's a strength-based perspective and an umbrella term to describe all the different and unique ways that people's brains work. And then neurodivergent is another term that we use in the community, which means then having a brain that works differently from, say, the average or normal.
No, that's really helpful. And as you said, it's a relatively new concept. It's arguably the area of diversity that's probably been less talked about and is less mature, if that's the right word, probably not the right word. So arguably an area of huge opportunity as well.
For sure.
We're in the sort of midst of the fourth industrial revolution, and certainly the acceleration of digital transformation is certainly a topic we hear every time we have guests on the show and the organizations that we work with at Insight 222. So there's that digital transformation of work, workforce and workplace. Why is it increasingly important to prioritize a neurodivergent culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think have thought a lot about this topic in particular, given my training, my background is as a cognitive scientist, right? And so I've thought a lot about not just neurodiversity and my expertise in terms of neurodiversity, but also where we're going, right, in terms of the future of work, where organizations are increasingly going to have to be more adaptive, where there's accelerating technological, social, and economic change. We're approaching, a future that's very different than we've seen in the past, especially where cognitive work is concerned, right? There's going to be a lot more cognitive work that's going to be taken over by automation. And so to me, though, neurodiversity is absolutely part of this conversation. And I think that so many leaders have been focused, rightfully so in many respects, on the technology component of this. Like, okay, we need to understand better AI. We need to understand better, like, these emerging technologies, how it could help our company and our organization be competitive. But I think where there's been less of a focus, and I think there needs to be more of a focus, is on the human resources side of this equation. That when a lot of cognitive work are being taken over by AI, that changes the game, right? That changes the human resources landscape. And I believe, neurodivergent people should always be valued, and there's regardless of anything else. But we are entering this time, I think, in history where there's more of a necessity of understanding neurodiversity and cognitive diversity and the kinds of skill sets that neurodivergent people bring to the equation and the table. And I advocate that, well, there's a concept called complementary cognition, and I advocate for, we don't have, it's ideal for not always the same, right? We just need to develop these cultures where neurodivergent people and neurotypical people and the increasingly importance of machine intelligence, that we all have a complementary role to play. And I think that it does elevate the importance, though, in the future work of people who think differently and trying to embrace all kinds of minds.
And actually, in the book here, for those who watch their podcast, because believe it or we do have some that watch their podcast, and in the sleeve notes, and I've seen this elsewhere as well, that actually we're talking quite a lot of people here, aren't we? It's people with the cognitive differences. It's 15 to 20% of the global population, isn't it? So it really is, A, it's the right thing to do, but B, it makes a hell of a lot of sense for organizations to be more inclusive around neurodivergent workers.
For sure. And yeah, a lot of people I found don't quite understand the scale, right? That, 15 to 20% of the global population is 1 in 5 people on the planet. And then there's been some interesting research that I've seen more recently. One of them was by a survey by Zen Business that showed that in terms of like some of the younger populations, like Gen Z, Generation Z, that they identify more strongly with the neurodivergent umbrella. I think it was a little bit over 50% that said they were either somewhat neurodivergent or definitely neurodivergent. And then there was another study by Tallow that showed that 80% of Gen Z Gen Z in general, felt that it was really important that they worked for an employer that valued and supported neurodivergent workers. So I think, this is increasingly something that should be of importance, right, to HR managers, to CEOs, to anyone who's in business, really, who's concerned about the future of their business and staying competitive.
Yeah, very good. And obviously you've been in this space for 20 years. Your lived experience as well as obviously the work that you're doing, and based on that experience and that research, what are some of the main challenges that neurodiverse employees face in the workplace?
Yeah, I think in general there's this huge disproportionality between the potential to contribute and the actual economic opportunity pathways that currently exist. And so the unemployment or underemployment rate is still unacceptably high, and across all neurodivergent cognitive typologies. It's somewhere between, the research shows it's somewhere between 30 and 40%, right? When you look at all the cognitive neurodivergent cognitive typologies. And then autistic people in particular have, it would appear, the highest unemployment or underemployment rates. There's different statistics out there, but some of them are as high as 85% unemployment or underemployment, and that's for college graduates. That's including college graduates. And so, and it's not because that these job seekers don't have skills that would massively benefit, their employers or be able to contribute. There's just so many layers of barriers, right, to successfully include all kinds of minds. And so, that's one of the things I talk a lot about in my book, and specific strategies, right, that HR managers and leaders can become more familiar with, that they might not be as aware of, that might be preventing genuine inclusivity. And some of them have to do with just becoming more aware of some of the cognitive biases and mental shortcuts that all of us take. Also, just the standardization of, how we do interviews, right? And interviews and job postings. There's all sorts of things that have been standardized in the past that could be barriers to um, finding the best talent, right? For the roles that are important in your organization. And you, of course, want to hire the best people, and there's barriers to that, I think.
And is one of the challenges maybe that, those that maybe don't take the time to understand this space particularly well, there are many different types of neurodiversity. I mean, you alluded to there that 30 to 40% underemployed, but actually that's higher with it when you're looking at autistic neurodivergent people. So,
Right.
maybe of the benefit of listeners. So most of our listeners are, in the HR space. I'd say 99% of them probably. Maybe what are the different types of, or the main different types of neurodivergent people that maybe we need to.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think there's still a lot of people that aren't familiar with the term, right? Neurodiversity and all the nuances and what it implies. And I think so there's the neurodiversity umbrella, right? And it's again an evolving term, but it includes a pretty broad spectrum of people whose brains work differently, right, from what we would consider neurotypical or normal. Well, if I would say the word normal, but like just neuronormative, I guess is the right term. But that includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome. There's so many, nonverbal uh, learning disorder. There's so many different typologies, but I think that in the broadest sense, realizing that probably already you have a good 15% to 20% of your workforce that fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, and some of those people may not be getting the support they need to be as productive and as they could be. Right. And so it's not just about, hey, how do we create cultures where we can recruit more neurodivergent people, but it's also about realizing that most organizations and companies already have neurodivergent people working for them, that could become even more productive and feel more, a sense of belonging in their organization if there's efforts put into place that acknowledge them, right, and acknowledge an appreciation for all kinds of minds. And so, but it is, the neurodiversity umbrella is really broad. And so there's some of the challenges are like, really learning the nuances of different, not just different types of neurodivergencies, but the complexities where there's a lot of neurodivergent people that don't fall under one diagnosis or box as well. There's increasingly, especially a lot of women who are both ADHD and autistic, and so in the community we call that ADHD, and that's kind of in a way, it manifests differently than if you were just say ADHD or autistic, and so there's just as a number of nuances too. But I think it's the most important thing is to not be afraid of the unknown, and if there's a lack of expertise in your organizations, it's so important to just be proactive, find the resources you need, and do what you can, right, to be an ally in your organization, whatever role you have, to make sure that you're building a culture where the broadest range of neurodiversity and cognitive diversity can feel a sense of belonging and can thrive. And that's ultimately going to translate into better returns for your organization and company. It's ultimately going to be in the best interest of your company as well.
And I guess, as you've alluded to as well, this is a field that's evolving.
Mm-hmm.
So we're learning more about different types of neurodiversity all the time. And I guess one thing that HR HR leaders need to do is stay on top of that, understand, where the science is evolving to. And I guess one of the other challenges is, a lot of people either choose not to disclose any neurodivergence because maybe they feel that it's going to have an impact on their ability to get promoted perhaps at work. And I guess sometimes it's undiagnosed as well. So there's all sorts of different complexities, isn't there, to look at both for the individuals themselves, but also the organizations that they're working in.
Correct. Yeah. And, and you bring up some really important points, like in the UK in particular. There was a study not that long ago in 2020 from the Institute of Leadership and Management that showed that over 50% of employers openly admitted they would not hire a neurodivergent job seeker. Now, I believe that, a lot of that, just from a lot of the interviews and work I've done and research I've done, that there's a lot of well-intentioned people. They just get nervous about their lack of expertise in doing this correctly. So I think that's part of it, but I think we need to get past that, right? And I think there's regardless of neurodivergent typology or categories, that if we think about this a little bit differently, if we just think about it as, okay, we're all human beings, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and we can complement each other, right, in terms of skill sets. And let's try to recruit for that diversity, more generally, right? Diverse experiential diversity, cognitive diversity, perceptual and analytical diversity, because that's going to be where there is, I think, a really strong competitive edge, especially in the future where we have in front of us, where innovation is going to be this huge, huge premium. And that's a concept in my book I call neurodiversification, right? Where in the past, in HR in particular, there's been, I think, too much of a focus on cultural fit, or what, how people, and the way people have I think, approached cultural fit, maybe even without being completely aware of it, is unconsciously sort of, following the scripts with these standardized interview processes. And it's like, okay, let's make is this person seem like someone I would want to go out for a drink with, after work? Or is this someone who really, seems a lot like me? And I think it's hard to resist that instinct, right? It's very ingrained. But I think that for the benefit of our organizations and companies, we need to become more aware of the problems associated with that kind of instinct, and go out of our way even to take a different path and be more flexible and say, okay, let's look more like, does this person actually value the core values of this organization? If you're an ed tech company, like, does this person care a lot about education? But outside of that, like, that person doesn't necessarily have to, be similar to me, as a hiring manager, or be someone I would want to, go out with after work and have a drink with necessarily. I mean, hey, if that person wants to, that's great. But like, you're thinking about it of like more of, okay, there's a value add to making sure that we're including people who are thinking about some of the problems and challenges that all organizations and companies are going to face increasingly in the future, and thinking about those from different angles, right? It's a huge risk, in my opinion, to organizations that are only hiring people that are thinking along similar lines, right? That aren't coming at problem solving from different analytical, experiential, or perceptual backgrounds, and that's why I talk a lot about, like, that a lot of the I think innovation in this space is going to have to come from the human resources side of things, where we're thinking differently about our human resources. We're being more flexible. We're finding ways to create these new opportunity pathways for people that have been, historically maybe excluded or undervalued, and finding ways to tap in and better understand the kinds of skill sets and talents that don't lend itself or um, don't necessarily come across really clearly in our standardized verbal interview process, and finding alternative ways to assess that talent. And that's going to be in the best interest of companies and organizations who really want to stay competitive, who, those that invest in this space, I believe anyway, are going to be, have a competitive edge going forward.
And then let's explore that a little bit more now. So let's bring it into sort of HR and what we can do as HR leaders and professionals to build a more neurodiverse culture. Let's start with recruitment, because you've talked a little bit about that already. What mistakes do you see organisations making in this area? I think you've talked about a couple of them there. And what do you advise that they should start doing to ensure more inclusive practices?
Yeah, it's a good question. And after
It talked about assessment interview, I think.
yeah,
well.
and after working in the space for many years, it's been interesting to see that there's obviously a lot more conversations happening right now, more public awareness about neurodiversity and the importance, even in the HR space, of recruiting neurodivergent workers. But one thing I found is that there's a big difference between, doing a more superficial approach of like, okay, let's only sort of modify some of our policies. Let's look at the HR policies and make sure we're, I don't know, that we're protected in terms of like including um, uh, valuing neurodiversity or anti-harassment policies, which is incredibly important, because a lot there's a lot of case studies out there that have shown some problems in that space. But I think the organizations that really buy in a deeper way and realize like, okay, that we need to look at our policies, for sure, but are the leaders all in? Is the CEO all in? Is the board all in? Is there really an active effort to not just change policies, but to talk about neurodiversity in a different way than we have in the past, to bring up positive stories, to actively try to combat the types of stereotypes that are so pervasive in our culture, where there's so many people, that like their understanding of even something like autism, right, is so limited, right? They saw 3 or 4 movies, they've met a couple people, and then they have just such a narrow definition and really don't understand the rich diversity, in which autism or ADHD or dyslexia, like every person is a very, very unique individual. And I think you know reinforcing on a daily basis, just whatever values an organization espouses. If an organization decides, hey, we're going to be all in valuing neurodiversity, making sure that it's not just a superficial interview with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and there's a value statement, which is incredibly important as a start, but making sure that there's consistency in the day-to-day operations, right? Where and there's encouragement, where people are telling positive stories about their neurodivergent colleagues. Like, people are more aware of a strength-based perspective, and also, just have a lot more empathy, right? Empathy for the types of things people might be struggling with. We then there's hope then, right? That we could start bridging these empathy and communication gaps. And that to me is incredibly important. But the starting point there is just becoming aware that how things have been done in the past maybe isn't the ideal situation for trying to unleash the potential of all your employees. And I do believe that if there's a culture that's built on solid foundation of psychological safety, and people feel comfortable not just disclosing but asking for the support they need, and not feeling like if they need clarification or ask a question, feeling like that's okay. And there's a culture that embraces not only that but also taking intellectual risks of bringing up ideas that haven't been brought up before. That's the kind of culture that's going to um, really, really benefit and thrive in the future we have in front of us. But it does require, I think, doing this sort of deeper work, right? Of having an honest examination of the organizational culture itself, rather than just, okay, we're going to start a neurodiversity at work pilot program and it's really separate from our culture, which has been a good start, in a lot of organizations. At least it's at least allowed a lot of neurodivergent people to have opportunities and get work. But in my opinion, we're ready now. I think the world is ready to have different conversations. And how do we actually include? How do we create these inclusive cultures that are going to be a win-win for everyone?
Maybe let's bring it to life with a couple of examples. So, you talk about it's got to be more than words on a page or a pilot or an editorial in the New York Times. It's got to be embedded into process. It's got to be role modeled. It's got to be spoken about. Ideally, you've got people, maybe senior people in organizations actually actually saying that they are neurodiversity, they are
Mhm.
neurodiverse, being role models and champions, I guess, for
Right.
it as well. What are, maybe give example a couple of companies that are doing this really well and what they're doing, that makes them stand out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of companies that have invested, in this process in a big way, and in different ways, right? Um, so one that's kind of taken a different approach that I've worked with directly is the Lego Foundation, and it's been unique in the sense that I helped them uh, spearhead a new social impact investment fund that's not taking equity, right, in social impact enterprises and nonprofits. And the idea there is, let's invest in the future of neurodiversity, and let's invest in global change makers that are creating new solutions that could help complement, not just what's happening in the schools, but the workplaces. And so one of the interesting things with that approach is that we've purposely created a situation where it's a co-creation model, right? So there's people lived experience that are involved in every step of the way, um, of helping these companies learn how to become more neuro-inclusive. And it's not just startups. There's been some publicly traded companies like Kahoot as an example, that was part of the initial cohort, the first cohort, where they hadn't really, invested that much in neurodiversity, even though they have, millions and millions of users and a huge platform. And so that partnership allowed them to start to rethink their platform from a more neuro-inclusive standpoint, realizing that there's a segment of the population that's maybe not participating in their platform, and then in their workforce as well, right? So it's both. So it's like, thinking about so I think that there's a number of companies that are making strides, I think, in this space. But I think it's not just about employment. It's also about, like, okay, are we involving neurodivergent people in our products, right, in our product strategy conversations? um, and then I've worked with a number of companies that some of them were more like sort of uh, Fortune 100 or middle range companies too, that were a little bit more nimble, right? Or scale ups. They're really were a little bit more nimble, where they could, from an early stage, invest in this longer term type of process, and you know uh, sort of buy into, okay, we're not going to just do a couple trainings, right, which is a good start, but like we're going to be, we're going to really fully buy in to, we want to make sure that our culture is one where it's inclusive. There's not this special ed track, for employees. We want to recruit the best talent, and we want to support the best talent, and working towards these deeper goals, right? Of making sure psychological safety, right? That's a huge one, and in my book, I talk a lot about that. I have a pyramid of neuro inclusion where I purposely put psychological safety as the sort of like foundational level and bedrock, because I think that while it's so important to eh, institute or codify a lot of the more neurodiversity friendly policies, sensory friendly policies, making sure that there's all sorts of other supports that are available, that in the absence of psychological safety, that's going to harm all employees, not just neurodivergent employees, right? And Google, they did it was Project Aristotle, where they studied all their most successful and innovative teams and found that it wasn't the teams that had the most resources, or even those that had the sort of more rock stars involved in their teams. It was psychological safety that made the biggest difference to innovation. And so, um, I think that companies taking that seriously, it's not going to just benefit um, their strategy in terms of recruiting more neurodivergent talent and uncommon skills that will help their organization, but it's also going to just change the culture where people are happier, healthier, more innovative, feel like they can take more risks that are ultimately going to translate into a competitive edge, and being more innovative, especially in the future we have in front of us, where there's going to be premium to that kind of risk taking and innovative thinking.
Yeah, really good. And so Maureen, in the Neurodiversity Edge, you present a framework, the three C's. Can you provide a description of the framework for listeners, and also how it assists organizations in becoming more inclusive?
Yeah, absolutely. So the three C's is codification and conduct drives culture. And so um, what I found is, so I've worked with a lot of companies and also colleges, and nonprofits and all types of organizations where there was an interest in developing a formal value statement, right? To say we value all kinds of talent, all kinds of minds. We want to be super, inclusive, neuro-inclusive, and see, make sure we're valuing diversity, not not just in the way that diversity has been defined in the past, but also make sure that we're explicitly including neurodiversity. And and that's a really great starting point. But what I found is that the organizations that have really excelled and benefited the most are the ones that put in efforts where they're not just doing the values. It's a good starting point, right? We do a value statement. We're making sure that we are setting the tone, right, and getting leadership involved. The leadership buy-in is so important, and the board, and ideally the board as well, where we're a culture that explicitly and outwardly values all kinds of minds. We want to build a culture that's we're supporting the potential of everyone. And yet I've worked with organizations that have taken those steps, and yet behind the scenes, um, the upper management failed to, or I guess a better way to say it is turn a blind eye, where there was some pretty toxic behaviors going on behind the scenes, with bullying and discrimination, or devaluing, neurodivergent people. Sometimes it's very subtle, just undermining the credibility of someone. I mean, sometimes there's a threat, right? If anytime you're trying to do something differently, some people get nervous about that. And then I think also there's just well-intentioned people that just aren't educated, right? That don't have the right information, don't understand how rich in terms of like the diversity the community actually brings to the table. And so I think that the three C's, why that's important is that it's super important to figure out what your North Stars are in terms of values, right? As an organization or company that guides all your investments, that guides so many decisions, that guides your identity, right? Your brand. But if you're inconsistent with that brand, then that's going to ultimately hurt that company or that organization. So the consistency between what you espouse as your values as an organization or company and what's actually happening on the ground on a day-to-day basis, what's encouraged, what the leaders, how people talk about neurodiversity, um, are people that are bullying or marginalizing neurodivergent people rewarded, right? If that happens, obviously that's a huge problem, because then on the one hand, then you're like explicitly valuing neurodiversity in these value statements and in the PR side of things in the news, and then the day-to-day reality, that's there's this different set of behaviors that are happening, and that's ultimately I think it's important for people to realize going to really develop a bad culture, right? A culture where duplicity is seen as what's valued rather than integrity. And so the three C's is just realizing that if you want to create a culture that's going to set the stage for innovation, going to set the stage for everyone to achieve their best potential, then you want to make sure that you know what your values are, right? And but those values aren't just sort of these empty statements, right? That are being made, but there's real effort that's put into place in terms of like what's actually, being aware as leaders, what's happening in the day to day in your company, in your organization, and making sure you're not rewarding people who are contributing to a toxic culture, right? So that it's clear where the boundaries are. And ultimately, that, understanding that and adhering to that, it will develop a culture of integrity in a way that's going to truly benefit everyone and allow people to um, feel like they can, ask questions, even there's no stupid questions anymore, right? And that kind of culture translates into helping neurodivergent people ask for clarification, ask for the support they need, be able to challenge the status quo. And that to me is especially, again, thinking about where we are, right, in the future of work, where things are going in the economic climate we have in front of us. That's going to be the culture, I think, where organizations and company will have the competitive edge. But they need to be aware that it's not just about, what they say. It's about what's happening in the day-to-day in their companies and culture and organizations, and having strategies in place to create a culture where there's an alignment between explicit values and the habits that we're reinforcing, every day, that are consistent with those values.
No, that's really good. There's this great quote in the book, in the Neurodiversity Edge. Maureen, obviously you wrote it, so you probably know. And I think you just talked to it there, really. A garden won't grow no matter how much sunlight and water it gets if the soil is toxic. And I think that comes back to what you were saying about the pyramid of neuro-inclusion, with psychological safety being at the top. Yeah, very good. I'm wondering, obviously, a lot of the companies or the HR professionals who are listening to this, they're working in organizations where teams are becoming more distributed, hybrid work is more common. What are some of the things that that they should be thinking about with their with regards to their neurodivergent employees? Is there anything specific around hybrid or teams being more distributed that actually could potentially have an impact, both positive and negative?
Sure. Yeah, and I get into this topic pretty deeply in a chapter called Workplace Flexibility, and I would say just it on the one hand, there's neurodivergent people, if you're serious about recruiting neurodivergent people, being flexible about geography and offering hybrid and remote options is absolutely important. But also just becoming aware of just where things are going, right? There's increasingly going to be a lot of roles more in general, right, that can lend themselves to remote work, and thinking about this differently um, I think is helpful, right? To attract the best talent, right? Whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical or it's increasingly become a topic, right? That's on people's minds especially since the pandemic. And I talk about this a lot, in the book, in the sense of I think that the bigger takeaway message that I'd want to get across is that being more flexible in how people do work doesn't mean that there's not high expectations for results and how that work is being done. And so um, I think it's most important to focus more on the objectives and the results that you want to see in your business, and then be more flexible in how you allow people to achieve those results. And and that's, I think, across the board, going to, just especially where things are going as well, going to be a better model for successful organizations. Now, of course, not every position is suitable, right, for remote work. But I think it's more of a mind shift, right? It's a mind shift of like trying to then just figure out, well, which roles could this work? Obviously, there's increasingly a lot of roles where people can be effective, right? If there's a hybrid or remote option and that's offered, and it's in and not every neurodivergent people thrives in in remote work as well. Some people do need the structure of the everyday office, but many do need the flexibility, right, of hybrid or remote work. And I think that, yeah, again, the takeaway message is the more, I think, a manager especially could have a little bit more authority over making some of these decisions, that is more seen as like, how is my team going to be the most productive, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, like being more flexible of how people achieve results, but being strict about, okay, here's the results we need to see be achieved. And I think being focused on that rather than, okay, everybody has to be in the office 5 days a week, or eh, I think it's about it should be about results.
No, agreed. Agreed, which probably lends itself quite nicely to the next question about analytics, and then we'll move to the question of the series afterwards. So Maureen, based on your experience of advising companies on creating more neurodiverse cultures, how have you seen the role of people analytics being utilized to foster that culture that supports neurodiversity?
Yeah, you know I think that there's increasingly awareness, not just of the importance of including more neurodivergent people in all kinds of minds, but um, also that this should become a broader part of our person-centered strategy, our looking at again, like the data and the people analytics, um, type of strategy. I guess I would say that at least from my perspective, I would encourage people that are in these roles that, if it's chief people officer or HR officer, to also do trainings, not just for managers, but for all staff. I think because I think that, when we're looking at a shift in how we think about these things, and it ultimately ends up being about what kind of culture we want our organizations to become, right? And that's an intentional process. It's important that it's not just one segment of the organization that learns about these things, but if possible, if there's it's always ideal, right, if there's knowledge that spreads throughout the organization. And I like to say from the mailroom to the boardroom, right? Because even at the board level, right, sometimes there's not a lot of awareness and understanding, and that goes into too, like, just becoming more aware of or questioning ourselves in some of the decisions that we make with our standardized ways of doing things, right? Like, so there's one thing called the overconfidence effect, right? Where I think, like, a lot of times, there's been a model that's worked over many, many years, and people kind of, um, default back to, oh, well, this is what's worked over the last 20 years, but not quite having an appreciation that we're in this really unique time in history where things are about to accelerate and change really fast. And, the world 10 years from now will look nothing, in my opinion, from the world, the last 15, 20 years. And so, different solutions and different approaches and more flexibility is really necessary, right, to be competitive and to stay on top of things, and um, sort of being open, right, to these conversations, and being open to, okay, whatever our data was over the last 20 years is not necessarily relevant to trying to better understand where the world is headed, and how we may need to adapt, and how we may need to be more flexible and do things differently, if not for any other reason, for the success of our company and our organization. Because if we don't do that, and if we're not one of the first people that are thinking more innovatively in this respect, our competitors will be.
Very good. So Maureen, we've got to the last question, and this is a question we're asking everyone in this series of the Digital HR Leaders podcast. More general question around culture, but I think you'll definitely be able to bring in elements that we've already talked about. What are the key elements that you believe are essential to building a strong company culture?
Yeah, I think there if companies take seriously going on this journey of reevaluating how they've done things in the past with um, traditional interviews, if they're open to doing more non-traditional interviews, if they're open to taking a hard look at their culture, doing an organizational audit, for instance, with regards to neurodiversity. There's lots of steps organizations can take that I believe will translate not only to better awareness and information that could be helpful to them, but also provide a roadmap that will help them future proof their organizations, understand their human resources strategy and portfolio. So it's not just about um, incorporating diversity, where, that's, of course, absolutely part of the strategy and the equation and super important. But it goes beyond that. It's like, okay, we're in this unprecedented time in history, and I think that being open-minded and being open to bring in expertise, to say, hey, okay, we don't understand neurodiversity very well, so we're not going to do anything about it because we don't have experts. I think that's I think that's a dangerous direction to go in. being open-minded to say, well, let's try to learn, right? Let's understand this better, and this is ultimately going to improve our organization. And then, just taking a hard look at uh, culture, right? And being willing as a leader to have the courage to have a significant role in shaping that culture. And that's where I really advocate for the CEOs and the board members, like at the top level leadership, having full buy-in, because that sets the tone. That sets the tone for the culture of the organization. If people see the CEO saying, "Wow, look at this amazing work this our autistic employees doing," and focusing on the strengths, other people notice that, right? And then I've seen in the past, like, then other neurodivergent people that no one knew were neurodivergent feel more comfortable disclosing, and then there's just a different level of conversation happening, and it just becomes more normalized, right? Where and then everybody is in a position where they feel more comfortable asking for what they need, or doing things in a way they're actually going to make them more productive, which translates again into even the bottom line, right? Is in the best interest of organizations, where people feel like they're in a culture where they can be themselves. They can, ask for what they need. There's they're able to be somewhere where they feel like they belong. And obviously there's a lot of mental health benefits to that situation, and then that ultimately translates to people showing up to work with their full selves, their best selves, wanting to be there, investing themselves fully into their jobs. And what more can an employer ask or want from their employees?
Well, that's the perfect way, I think, to end our conversation, Maureen. Thank you so much. It's such an important topic, and one that's evolving, pretty quickly as well. And I think clearly it's a topic that you're an expert on, and I think a lot of our listeners will really have learned a lot over the last sort of 45, 50 minutes. So thank you very, very much. How can people stay in touch with you, find out more about your work, find out more about the Neurodiversity Edge?
Yeah. So I'm active on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, Dr. Maureen Dunne. You could check out my website. It's just www.neurodiversityedge.org. But yeah, definitely, I'd love if there's any questions to reach, for people to reach out to engage, with me, or sign up for our newsletter. That would be great. That'd be amazing.
Fantastic. So we'll put all that in the show notes, but neurodiversity.org seems like the best place to find out more.
Sure.
Maureen, thank you very much for being a guest on the show. I've seen you spoken at Unleash in the past. So I may bump into you at a future Unleash, perhaps. I don't know if you're going to Paris later this year, but I will be there.
Yeah.
So if so, I'll look forward to meeting you in person.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Maureen.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice, and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.